I never thought a quiet driveway could turn into a battlefield. But when Karen rolled her ATV across my property like it was a public road, everything changed. It wasn't just a shortcut, it was a blatant challenge, a test of how far someone could push a neighbor before consequences caught up. Papers, warnings, and threats started arriving, each one more absurd than the last. And just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, it did. The question is, how far would I go to reclaim what was mine, and make her regret every single step? Life in our little corner of the neighborhood had always felt peaceful. Nestled between rows of manicured lawns and quiet streets, our home was a place where morning coffee on the porch meant watching the sunrise, and evenings were spent in the yard, laughing as the kids chased the dog around the garden. For years, the neighbors waved. The mail arrived on time, and the only sounds were the occasional bird or the distant hum of a lawnmower. We had finally carved out a space that felt ours, a small sanctuary in a world that often moved too fast. Our driveway was long and private, flanked by tall hedges that marked the boundary of our property. It was the one stretch of land where we could leave the doors open, the kids could play safely, and for a moment, the world outside didn't exist. We had no intention of changing anything, no plans to disrupt the rhythm of the neighborhood. We thought the invisible rules of courtesy and respect would be enough. But then, the first hint of trouble appeared, not in a dramatic confrontation, but in a subtle, almost unnoticeable way. A neighbor, someone who had always seemed polite in passing waves, began cutting across our driveway on her ATV. At first, it seemed minor, an inconvenience rather than a confrontation. Still, there was a sharpness in her eyes, a sense that she didn't see boundaries the same way the rest of us did. I had no idea then that what seemed like a small breach of etiquette would become a relentless test of patience, property, and principle. That one act, riding where she had no right, was the first spark. And sparks, as we were about to learn, can ignite fires that no one expects, not even in the quietest of neighborhoods. At first, I tried to ignore it. I told myself that maybe she'd get bored of cutting across my driveway, or that common courtesy would eventually take over. But the next morning, I discovered deep tire tracks pressed into the grass along the edge of the property. Evidence that Karen hadn't just used the driveway once or twice, but had made it a routine shortcut. My quiet sanctuary was turning into her personal trail. I couldn't just let it happen. I decided to address it politely. A note slipped under her door, friendly but firm, asking her to respect our property line. I thought that would be the end of it. Instead, it opened the floodgates. Within days, I received a formal notice from the HOA. Apparently, the act of putting up a simple, "No trespassing" sign violated some obscure aesthetic rule. The notice cited a clause that claimed any sign larger than a few inches required board approval. I stared at the words in disbelief. The same HOA that didn't intervene when neighbors parked illegally, or when common areas were left untended, suddenly had the authority to dictate how I marked my own property. I tried to reason with them, attending meetings, sending emails, and explaining the situation. Each response I received was a variation of, "We're looking into it," or "Please comply with community guidelines." Every time I thought I had made progress, another fine appeared in the mail. $50. Then $75. Then one for $100. I could feel my frustration mounting, but also a quiet anger, a resolve to not let arbitrary rules strip away what was mine. Meanwhile, Karen didn't slow down. She started arriving earlier in the mornings, often revving the ATV near the house just as the sun rose. It wasn't just about convenience anymore, it was intimidation. My kids started avoiding the front yard. I began checking the driveway before leaving or returning home. The joy I had once found in our sanctuary had been replaced by vigilance and stress. The HOA compounded the absurdity with a series of increasingly petty accusations. One week, they claimed the hedges lining my driveway were too tall, obstructing sight lines. The following week, it was a complaint about tire marks from my own car, which somehow violated community standards. Every meeting felt like walking through quicksand. Every step forward seemed to drag me 2 steps back. I could see some of the other homeowners watching quietly, some nodding in sympathy, others pretending to be neutral, but everyone seemed aware that I had become the target of an escalating power play. At the same time, I discovered that Karen had been quietly rallying other neighbors. Anonymous emails started showing up in my inbox, thinly veiled threats, warnings that the HOA was watching, and reminders of the fines accumulating against me. Even casual walks down the street became tense. I couldn't help but notice the way people looked at me. Sometimes with curiosity, sometimes with judgment. It was subtle, but it felt isolating. I realized that the dispute wasn't just about my driveway. It was about power, influence, and the lengths some people would go to assert control. I considered giving in. I considered paying the fines, conceding the "no trespassing" signs, and quietly hoping the situation would resolve itself. But every time I thought that, I saw Karen on her ATV, the grin on her face as she crossed the property line, ignoring the boundaries. That smugness fueled a quiet determination inside me. If I gave up, Shay and the HOA's petty enforcement would win, and I wasn't ready to surrender. Then things escalated further. Late one afternoon, I found a notice taped to my front door, in bold letters: violation of HOA rules, $200 fine, immediate compliance required. No explanation beyond that, no discussion, just a demand backed by the threat of legal action. By now, I was juggling letters, emails, and phone calls, each one more frustrating than the last. I started documenting everything: photos of tire tracks, videos of repeated ATV crossings, timestamps of conversations. I felt like a soldier preparing for a battle, each piece of evidence a weapon to counter absurdity with facts. But Karen was unpredictable. One morning, I returned from work to find a series of chalk marks across the driveway, outlining paths that she had tested the day before. It was mocking, a psychological game that made me question my sanity. I began noticing her lurking on the edges of my property, sometimes filming, sometimes gesturing at imaginary violations. The harassment had moved from mere inconvenience to a full-blown campaign of intimidation. It was at this point that I realized the fight couldn't just be about compliance with HOA rules. It had to be about setting boundaries, reclaiming my property, and demonstrating that there were consequences for crossing lines. I started researching local ordinances, consulting friends who had faced similar disputes, and even looking into small claims or civil protections. Every conversation revealed just how murky the rules were, how the HOA wielded authority selectively, and how neighbors could exploit ambiguities for personal gain. Late one evening, while reviewing photographs of the driveway, I noticed something odd. Karen's ATV tracks weren't consistent. They were wider in some places, narrower in others, sometimes overlapping. That's when it hit me. She wasn't just cutting through. She was testing limits, experimenting with patterns, trying to see how far she could go without facing pushback. The realization was chilling. She wasn't reckless, she was deliberate. Every crossing, every rev of the engine, Every careless smirk was part of a strategy designed to unsettle me and erode my confidence in defending my home. At the next HOA meeting, tensions reached a boiling point. I presented my documentation, photos, video clips, a timeline of violations and fines. I expected acknowledgement, perhaps even intervention. Instead, Karen sat there, calm and composed, denying everything. The board seemed hesitant to confront her directly, as if her reputation in the neighborhood carried weight that my evidence could not outweigh. I felt a mix of anger, disbelief, and exhaustion. The system that was supposed to protect homeowners seemed stacked in favor of intimidation and influence. Walking home that night, I replayed the events over and over. Every fine, every note, every encroachment, the pattern was clear. This wasn't just about an ATV or a driveway, it was about power, control, and the willingness of some people to manipulate rules for personal amusement. And yet, amidst the frustration, a seed of resolve had grown. If the HOA wouldn't protect me, if neighbors wouldn't step up, then it would be up to me to reclaim my property and restore some sense of justice. I started planning quietly, thinking of ways to assert boundaries without violating any regulations. I considered surveillance cameras, physical barriers, and creative deterrents, but nothing felt sufficient to address the audacity of her repeated trespasses. Each day, the anticipation of the next encounter built, like a storm approaching on the horizon. I didn't know exactly how it would unfold, but I knew one thing: Karen had underestimated me, and she was about to discover that some homeowners fight back in ways they never expect. As the sun dipped behind the horizon and the neighborhood fell into its usual evening quiet, I stared at the driveway, at the tracks, the chalk outlines, the invisible lines she had crossed. The tension had reached a point where the next move, from either side, could completely shift the balance of power. And in that silence, I realized the fight was no longer just about convenience or rules. It had become a test of patience, strategy, and endurance. One misstep could change everything. And just like that, the neighborhood that had seemed so peaceful only weeks ago had transformed into a battlefield. With no clear winner in sight, the question now wasn't whether I would act. It was how. Weeks of frustration, fines, and silent intimidation had built to a pressure I could no longer contain. Every morning, waking to the fresh tire tracks cutting across my driveway, every letter from the HOA, every subtle taunt from Karen had combined into a relentless storm. The feeling wasn't just anger anymore. It was a cold, determined clarity. I had documented everything: photos, videos, dates, timestamps. I knew the law, I knew the HOA rules inside and out, and I knew she was pushing every limit she could find. The question was no longer if I would act. It was how and when. It started one morning, the air crisp, the sun just beginning to cast long shadows across the neighborhood. I had set up a series of small, unobtrusive cameras along the edges of the driveway, capturing every approach. Each angle was carefully placed, designed not just to record, but to reveal patterns: her timing, her speed, her audacity. I had also researched local ordinances regarding property trespass, vehicle use, and even noise. Every loophole she might exploit had been anticipated. I wasn't just preparing to defend my home, I was preparing to confront her publicly, legally, and unambiguously. The first sign of the escalation came when Karen rolled up on her ATV earlier than usual, engine growling, eyes scanning the property as if daring me to challenge her. I stayed inside, camera rolling, heart pounding, waiting for her move. She stopped halfway down the driveway, revving the engine, clearly trying to provoke a reaction. I could hear the faint whispers of neighbors across the street, some peering from windows, others pausing mid-walk, sensing the tension. The quiet streets suddenly felt alive with expectation, as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath. Then it happened. She crossed the first boundary line. Her ATV tires crushed the manicured edge of the hedges I had painstakingly maintained, leaving deep tracks in the soil. My blood boiled, but I stayed calm. I opened the front door slowly, camera capturing every second, and stepped onto the porch. She froze, recognizing that I was watching, but her smirk remained, a mix of arrogance and disbelief that I would confront her directly. "Karen," I called, voice steady but firm. "Every move you make is documented. The HOA's rules don't give you the right to treat my property like a racetrack. You've crossed the line, literally and figuratively." Her eyes narrowed. She revved the engine again, this time leaning into a challenge. But I wasn't intimidated. I had prepared for this. From my pocket, I pulled the stack of HOA violation notices, the photos, and the copies of local ordinances. Every fine she had manipulated, every informal threat she had made, every attempt to use the HOA as a weapon. All of it was ready to be laid bare. What happened next was the moment I had been building toward. I calmly signaled to the cameras to start recording live feed to my phone, then walked slowly to the edge of the driveway. I began placing bright, official-looking, cow crossing signs across the path she was about to take. Sturdy posts, highly visible, marking the boundary clearly. There was nothing illegal about the signs. They were functional, humorous, and unmistakable in their message. Her jaw dropped. The smirk faltered. She looked from sign to sign, realizing that every inch of trespass was now highlighted, documented, and public. Neighbors across the street had begun to emerge, curious, whispering, phones in hand. Some waved politely, others watched silently, but the effect was immediate. Karen was on display, exposed in front of witnesses. I didn't stop there. I grabbed my phone and dialed the HOA office, deliberately putting the call on speaker. I reported the ongoing trespass, citing each ordinance, each documented pattern of behavior, and each fine that had been unfairly levied against me. The HOA representative on the line stammered, caught off guard. For the first time, they were hearing a complete, organized, irrefutable account. I calmly informed them that I would escalate to the local authorities if the behavior continued, and that all communication and documentation would be submitted for review. The balance of power had shifted. Karen's face turned red, not just with anger, but with embarrassment. For the first time, the neighborhood saw her for what she was. Someone abusing perceived authority and neighborhood influence to intimidate and control. Her ATV engine sputtered uncertainly, and she finally stopped, realizing that the theater of aggression she had relied on was no longer effective. The turning point came when I stepped forward and positioned myself directly along her projected path, keeping the camera rolling. I didn't shout. I didn't act rashly. I simply stood there, pointing out each clearly marked sign and stating aloud, "This property is private. These boundaries are legally enforceable. Every move you make is documented. You are trespassing." Every word was deliberate, calm, and audible to the neighbors who had gathered. I could see whispers spreading through the small crowd that had formed, some nodding in approval, others simply shocked at the audacity of the confrontation. She tried to argue, but the argument was empty. My documentation spoke louder than words: dates, times, photos, live cameras, public witnesses. She couldn't deny the evidence. Her usual charm, her assumed superiority, her habit of making rules bend in her favor, all of it crumbled under the weight of preparation and exposure. By this point, the street was no longer empty. Neighbors filmed discreetly from windows, some cautiously stepped onto their lawns, and a few even offered quiet support. The atmosphere was electric, a mixture of tension and anticipation, as if everyone sensed the final chapter of this drawn-out battle was unfolding before their eyes. I could feel the adrenaline coursing through me. Not fear, but clarity, focus, and the satisfaction of being prepared to defend what was rightfully mine. Then, in a last-ditch attempt to regain control, Karen revved the ATV one more time and tried to make a pass. But the signs, strategically placed, forced her to swerve dangerously close to the edge of the driveway, leaving a trail of dust and debris behind. It was a spectacle. The crowd gasped, and I knew the moment had arrived. Her reckless act had not only demonstrated her disregard for rules, but also made her actions undeniable to every witness. I called the authorities, not angrily, but matter-of-factly, reporting the attempted trespass and reckless behavior. By the time they arrived, Karen had parked the ATV and was attempting to retreat, but the damage was done. She couldn't deny the evidence, the witnesses, or the overwhelming documentation I had compiled. The neighborhood had seen the full scope of her disregard, and the HOA could no longer feign ignorance. Finally, I took a step back, letting the cameras capture the aftermath. Tire tracks crisscrossed the driveway, signs marked every boundary, and neighbors looked on in quiet validation. Karen, for the first time, was silent, visibly frustrated and humiliated. She realized that the power she had wielded through intimidation, manipulation, and selective enforcement of rules had been dismantled by preparation, patience, and a strategic response. It wasn't revenge in the petty sense, it was justice. The signs, the documentation, the public exposure, they weren't about embarrassment for its own sake. They were about reclaiming authority over my property, asserting boundaries, and proving that no one, not even a persistent, manipulative neighbor, could disregard rules or courtesy without consequence. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the neatly marked driveway, I looked at Karen one last time. She turned and walked toward her truck, the energy of confrontation drained, replaced by a grudging acknowledgement of defeat. The neighborhood, once a backdrop to tension and harassment, now stood as witnesses to the turning point. The battle had reached its peak, and the outcome was undeniable. And yet, even as I surveyed the scene, the signs, the cameras, the scattered tire tracks, a thought lingered. This confrontation, however decisive, was only one chapter. The question remained, would the neighborhood truly respect boundaries moving forward? Or had this just revealed the lengths some would go to in testing limits? The answer wasn't clear yet. But one thing was certain. I had taken the stand, drawn the line, and the balance of power had irrevocably shifted. And in that moment, with the cameras still rolling and the neighborhood watching, I realized the next step, how to ensure lasting respect, was just around the corner. After the confrontation, a heavy sense of relief settled over our home. The tension that had clung to the driveway, the hedges, and even the walls inside the house began to lift, slowly but unmistakably. The battle had been exhausting, draining every ounce of patience and energy, but the result was undeniable. Karen's unchecked audacity had finally met its match. For the first time in weeks, we could breathe without scanning the street or worrying about tire tracks cutting through our sanctuary. The driveway, once a symbol of constant conflict, now felt like a reclaimed space, ours in every sense of the word. The HOA, finally confronted with clear evidence and a public demonstration of harassment, had little choice. The board issued a formal notice recognizing the legitimacy of my claims and dismissing the fines that had been levied unjustly. More importantly, they established a review of property boundaries and rules enforcement to prevent such selective application in the future. It wasn't just a personal victory. It was a small but significant systemic shift, one that reassured the neighborhood that fairness could still prevail against arbitrary power. Karen, predictably, tried to regain some semblance of authority. She sent an email attempting to frame the incident as an overreaction on my part, claiming the cow crossing signs were provocative and that I had escalated unnecessarily. But by this point, the momentum had shifted irreversibly. The documentation, recordings, and the public nature of the confrontation left no room for her narrative to take root. Neighbors, who had previously remained silent, now spoke up, sharing their own minor grievances, their own experiences of intimidation, validating that the problem had not been isolated to my household. The ripple effects were immediate and profound. The neighborhood dynamic began to change. Other homeowners, emboldened by the resolution, started asserting their own boundaries more confidently. The aura of fear and intimidation that Karen and, indirectly, the HOA's lax enforcement had fostered gradually dissipated. Community discussions shifted from hushed complaints to open conversations about fairness, property rights, and mutual respect. Meetings that had once been dominated by bureaucratic monotony became forums where residents felt heard and empowered. For me personally, the aftermath was a mix of relief and reflection. The confrontation had tested every aspect of my patience, planning, and resolve. I had spent sleepless nights analyzing rules, documenting every infraction, and strategizing the timing and presentation of my counter-move. It was exhausting, yes, but it had also been instructive. I had discovered an inner capacity to remain calm under provocation, to anticipate behavior, and to marshal evidence with precision. More than that, I had learned the value of standing firm, not through aggression, but through preparation, clarity, and a methodical approach to justice. The physical space of our property began to transform as well. The cow crossing signs, initially placed as a tactical deterrent, became permanent markers. A reminder that boundaries are not suggestions, but rights to be respected. Over time, neighbors began joking about them lightheartedly, yet the humor carried an unmistakable undertone of caution. The signs symbolized not only a personal victory, but a collective lesson. The once invisible lines of our property were now visible, unambiguous, and reinforced by community awareness. Interestingly, Karen's behavior changed in subtle but telling ways. She no longer made casual crossings, no longer attempted to manipulate or intimidate, and her presence in the neighborhood became quieter, more tentative. It wasn't public humiliation that had subdued her, it was accountability. The combination of documented evidence, legal awareness, and community witnesses had shifted the power dynamic. She had been forced to recalibrate, forced to recognize that actions have consequences, and that persistence and planning can counter even the most audacious attempts at control. The long-term consequences extended beyond our immediate dispute. The HOA, under scrutiny, revised several policies to ensure transparency and fairness. Enforcement guidelines were clarified, notice procedures were standardized, and homeowners gained more accessible avenues to contest fines or reports of violations. It was a structural improvement prompted, indirectly, by the conflict. A change that would benefit residents long after our driveway drama had settled. The neighborhood, often complacent, had witnessed firsthand that assertiveness and documentation could influence policy and protect individual rights. At the personal level, the experience strengthened our family bond. The children, once anxious about venturing into the front yard, now played freely, their laughter once again filling the space that had been tense with conflict. We spent more time outside, hosting small gatherings and reconnecting with neighbors in a way that had been impossible during the weeks of stress. Our home, both physically and emotionally, felt reclaimed, fortified not just by signs and cameras, but by the confidence we had gained in asserting ourselves. Emotionally, there was a lingering satisfaction in seeing justice achieved without resorting to petty revenge. The strategy had been deliberate, measured, and effective. I had not responded with malice or chaos, I had responded with clarity, evidence, and an unwavering commitment to fairness. Karen's embarrassment, while inevitable, was not the goal. The goal had been to protect my home, uphold boundaries, and restore equilibrium. That distinction, I realized, was what made the victory enduring rather than fleeting. The community noticed the change, too. Conversations at the mailbox, casual greetings during evening walks, and even HOA meetings carried a new tone. One of cautious optimism. Residents began discussing neighborhood improvement projects, shared responsibilities, and mutual respect. The atmosphere shifted from one of passive acceptance of arbitrary authority to one of active engagement and accountability. It was as though the confrontation had served as a wake-up call, prompting everyone to recognize that boundaries, rules, and respect are not abstract concepts. They are lived realities that require attention and assertion. Over the following months, I continued to refine and maintain the property, reinforcing the physical and symbolic boundaries we had fought to protect. The cow crossing signs became a fixture, a humorous yet practical reminder of the events that had unfolded. Neighbors often stopped by to comment, laugh, or take pictures, but each interaction carried a subtle acknowledgement of the principles that had been defended: patience, preparation, and persistence. It was a visual testament to the power of proactive defense in the face of ongoing provocation. Reflecting on the journey, I realized that the experience had imparted several lessons. First, preparation is everything. Anticipating behavior, documenting actions, and understanding the rules turned what could have been a chaotic dispute into a controlled and decisive confrontation. Second, restraint paired with strategy is more powerful than impulsive action. By remaining calm and methodical, I was able to transform frustration into effective action, asserting authority without escalating the conflict unnecessarily. Third, visibility and accountability matter. Public witnesses and clear documentation not only protect individual rights but also reinforce collective norms, shaping how others engage with the community. Even now, years later, the impact of that summer lingers. The neighborhood has become more vigilant, more respectful of boundaries, and more willing to hold each other accountable. The HOA, once seen as a bureaucratic enforcer of arbitrary rules, is now a more transparent and accountable body, aware that residents are attentive, informed, and capable of challenging abuses of power. And personally, the experience left a lasting imprint on our family's sense of agency. The knowledge that we could face intimidation, confront absurdity, and emerge victorious without compromising our principles. There were moments of lingering tension, of course. Karen occasionally appeared in the vicinity, giving the occasional glance toward the driveway, but the energy had shifted irreversibly. She no longer acted with confidence, no longer attempted shortcuts or casual provocations. The balance of power had changed, subtly but permanently. It was a quiet victory, one that required patience and strategy rather than theatrics. And that quietness made it all the more powerful. The story also reinforced the importance of community awareness. When neighbors observed the confrontation, They witnessed not just a personal dispute, but a demonstration of civic responsibility and proactive engagement. People began to realize that standing up for one's rights doesn't have to involve conflict in the traditional sense. It can be about preparation, clarity, and making actions visible and accountable. That lesson, perhaps, is the most enduring impact of all. Looking back, it's clear that the conflict transformed more than the driveway or the HOA rules. It transformed our approach to life in the neighborhood. We became more attentive, more confident in asserting boundaries, and more deliberate in protecting what matters. The confrontation, while dramatic, served as a catalyst for positive change, both within our household and within the wider community. What had started as a petty dispute over an ATV shortcut became a test of principle, strategy, and resolve, and in that test, we discovered strengths we hadn't realized we possessed. And in the quiet moments, when the children played freely and the driveway remained untroubled, I often thought about the lessons learned. Boundaries, respect, and preparation are not just abstract concepts. They are active, lived realities. Standing firm doesn't always require aggression, but it does demand awareness, patience, and clarity. In asserting those principles, the neighborhood learned a powerful lesson that audacity, arrogance, and intimidation can be met with calm, deliberate action, and that integrity, preparation, and persistence are often stronger than fear or manipulation. The story of that driveway, the tire tracks, the fines, the cow crossing signs, and the confrontation, became more than a personal saga. It became a lesson for the entire community, a reminder that fairness can prevail, that rules can be enforced equitably, and that homeowners don't have to accept harassment in silence. It was a testament to the power of preparation, clarity, and moral courage. A story that continues to resonate in the neighborhood, in meetings, and in casual conversations, inspiring others to stand firm when faced with challenges, no matter how absurd or intimidating they may seem. In the end, the driveway was more than a stretch of asphalt. It was a symbol. A symbol of boundaries, respect, and the quiet triumph of measured, strategic action over manipulation and intimidation. It was proof that patience, planning, and persistence could reclaim not just property, but dignity, peace, and authority. And as I stood there one evening, watching the sun cast long shadows across the now peaceful driveway, I couldn't help but ask myself, and the viewers who had followed the journey, what boundaries in their own lives were waiting to be asserted, and what lengths they might go to reclaim the respect, space, and fairness they deserve. Because sometimes, the smallest battles, over a driveway, a rule, or a principle, can teach the largest lessons. And those lessons, when applied thoughtfully, can change not only the outcome of a single dispute, but the culture of an entire community.